This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
This was just a great football game. I compliment Florida State, Charlie Ward. They refused to quit. Our players didn't either. It's one game, and I think lived up to all the hype.
We're going back to November 13th, 1993, Florida State, Notre Dame, number one, number two. This is the game of the century, before the game of the century, before the game of there's been so many since, but this is one of the first that were actually marketed as the game of the century, and it turned out to be
a remarkable one. And this was actually the very first game that College Game Day showed up live and in person, believe it or not. I didn't realize that going into it, but this was the first live broadcast on location, on campus for College Game Day, and the rest is history.
But it's not only just what happened during the game that caught our attention rewatching it. It's everything that happens around this game and the lead into it as well. Welcome into Distant Replay Podcast. I am Ben George. He is Mike Noto. And Mike, I haven't heard you as excited after watching a game as you were when you finished this game up and you let me know you were done. But you were just fired up at how this game really reminded you how you got into college football and how anybody could have pulled for Florida State Notre Dame in the early 90s.
We do these regular season college football games we do never disappoint. And this one was, to me, the best of the bunch. When I was a kid, I was a University of Miami fan, and I grew up around all Notre Dame fans. So I had no reason to like either of these teams, but I was completely enthralled by this game in 1993, and I'm completely enthralled today.
Yeah, so we got a lot to get into tonight. Just to give you a little preview, we're going to be talking about two great coaches. We got O.J. Simpson in this game. This is vintage 90s. We got Notre Dame football. We got Touchdown Jesus. We got a great ending. We got a lot of stuff to unpack in this game. But before we do, let me remind you, you can watch the full game on our website, distantreplaypodcast.com. I'll put the YouTube link there. You can watch it for yourself as it aired on NBC. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and also on YouTube. All of our shows are up on YouTube as well if you want to check them out there. So there's a lot to get into, Mike. Let's begin with the lead into this game because, as I mentioned, Game of the Century is what it was called. It was number one, Florida State versus number two, Notre Dame. And I thought what was most remarkable, and I guess I remember this now that when I actually think about it, but just quickly when I heard 93 Florida State, Bobby Bowden, right? I kind of thought that Florida State was a little more established at this point than they actually were. They had a really good run up into this point of just being towards the top of the standings, I think top four for 6 straight years. This is a program that really had not won anything significant yet.
Yeah, they hadn't won a national championship up to this point. Bobby Bowden hadn't won a national championship up to this point as a coach, period. They had some good players throughout the years, right? Dion Sanders comes to mind as a good player there in the 80s. Remember, they're right at the beginning of that run where they were in the top 5 in the AP poll from 1987 to 2003, which is incredible.
Remarkable, yeah.
Yeah. So we're right at the beginning of that. And Charlie Ward, from my recollection, and we'll get into him in a second, but to me, he kind of put this program on the map because him along with Bowden became that sort of twosome where you said, now they have a chance to compete on a national level and an excellent chance at winning a national championship with these two.
Yeah, and I'm glad we got to see Charlie Ward again, and we'll talk about this more as we go through the game itself, but that dude was awesome. And I don't know if a lot of people think of him as a football player. I mean, what do you think the perception of Charlie Ward is when you talk about him now? Do you think basketball or do you think football first?
I think people who were watching football back then, like you and me, who grew up with Charlie Ward first as a football player, I think we think football player first. I think, though, what makes maybe most people think of him as a basketball player was that he played in the biggest market in the country on the Knicks on a very, very identifiable and legendary team in the eyes of New Yorkers. So that's probably his lasting legacy is as an NBA point guard. I think if you ask people, I would say it's probably 60-40. People more remember him as a point guard than a all-world quarterback.
Yeah, because when I think about him, like you mentioned, I think about him as a Florida State quarterback. He was good at Florida State basketball, but I think you could see his level of talent and how much better he was than people on the football field. He was really good in basketball, obviously playing the NBA for a while, but I think he was just at a different level in football compared to basketball. I think he was really good, but there were his equals in the court.
Completely agree. He was an average NBA starting point guard, but he was just on a team that lives in New York lore. Everyone loves those mid-90s Knicks teams, mid-late 90s Knicks teams. So, yeah, and he was a central part of those teams. But I agree. His talent stuck out more on the college football field for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the other side of this, you had Notre Dame coming in who, again, there's a reason why you grew up around Notre Dame fans. There is a reason why, coming clean, I pulled for Notre Dame a lot as a young kid because you saw these games, you saw who they were, their tradition, and you had to, as Chris Fowler in this broadcast we talked about, I mean, the excellence over time is what you think about with Notre Dame. And they had this legacy going, but not only did they have the tradition, they were currently one of the best teams in college football. They were only a few years removed from that 1988 national championship. Lou Holtz had guided them to 4 10-win seasons in the past 5 going into this year. Now, 10 wins then meant a lot more than it does now. I mean, teams are playing 15 or 16 games in some cases now. 10 wins is just that's a good benchmark. It's not incredible or remarkable. This is when you're winning 10 and playing 11, 12, maybe 13 on some really big years, but otherwise 11 or 12, that's a really good season. This is the Notre Dame team we think about, and I think it's still a lot of people think about when they think of Notre Dame as they envision these days.
Yeah, if you have an annoying person in your life that's between let's say 35 and 50, you wonder why.
Do you have anybody in mind?
I have someone in mind, one of our buddies. Yeah, you know who I have in mind. And you wonder, why do they like Notre Dame so much? Go back and watch this game and you'll start to get it. Why do they keep on talking about Notre Dame's tradition and Shake Down the Thunder and Newt Rockne and all this? This is where they get it from, because we're full on into the Lou Holtz era here, and we're coming off of the Tim Brown Heisman Trophy season. We're coming off the brilliance of the national championship led by Tony Rice and the option attack. Rocket Ismail was a couple of years before this. So this is full-fledged. You come into Notre Dame, you're dealing with Holtz and the boys and all of the wake up the echoes, all the stuff you read about that you're probably sick of hearing about. It was a legit thing back in 1993. Yeah,
it was. It was indeed. Now, I've got some historical kind of context I want to add to this discussion. But before we do, because it ties into a lot of the Open and a lot of the broadcast, the beginning of the broadcast, pregame coverage. So I want to just save that for 1 second. And let's go to the rosters real quick and talk about players and a little more background on Bowden and Holtz. But first, players. Now, I was surprised going through these rosters how few guys I actually recognize for Notre Dame. Because you're talking about one of the top programs in college football. You're talking about a team that this season is on track for a national championship. But when you run down their roster, I only had 1 or 2 guys that actually remember being significant football players. The rest of the guys, you have to be a pretty big either Notre Dame fan, a really deep into it college football fan, or a really dedicated NFL fan to really be familiar with many of these names on the roster.
Yeah, I would say that the names on the roster that if you're a really big football fan, you'd probably recognize would be Aaron Taylor, Bryant Young, who was a defensive tackle for the 49ers, Bobby Taylor, who was a defensive back for the Eagles, Jeff Burris, who played safety and running back in this game, ended up, I think, on the Rams. And then you may remember a guy like a Lee Becton, who was a very good college running back. But like you said, this is not a star-studded Notre Dame team.
Not at all. And you go to the Florida State side, this is why, I remember these guys and remember a lot of these names. Obviously, Charlie Ward, is front and center in this group. But you go down their list, and there's some guys there that were real players. And this is kind of what I thought I would see from Notre Dame when I went back through the roster, because I thought I'd see a bunch of guys that would go on to do a lot in the NFL, maybe have really, really good NFL careers. But on the Florida State side, Charlie Ward, obviously, Tamarick Vanover, one of the great college football names. And that's the guy that when you hear that name, you're like, this guy can run fast and catch the ball. He was a great receiver. You had on defense, I think specifically was where a lot of these guys were. You had Derek Brooks. You had Devin Bush. You had Clifton Abraham, Corey Sawyer. I mean, that defense was loaded, and the offense was good too, but there are more some younger players on that list.
Yeah, so we just named all those players on Florida State, which you probably know most of them, if not all of them, right? Did you mention Kes McCorvey?
Nope.
Great name. Another guy, Kes McCorvey. Wow, he must run a 4.40 and be awesome, right? And the backfield for Florida State in this game for most of the game was a young freshman named Warwick Dunn and a fullback named William Floyd, who would go on, him and Bryant Young from Notre Dame would go on to be a part of these mid-90s 49ers good teams with Steve Young. But Florida State was the team with the guys where you're like, wow, I mean, Derek Brooks, we're talking about an all-time player, like all-time.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable seeing those names and seeing those guys. And he had a big impact in this game, and he got hurt, which was also a big part of that impact that he made on this game. But so those are the rosters, and I don't think we left anybody up. But the big story, again, was Charlie Ward. He's the headliner. He is the Heisman favorite at this point. He is essentially, going in this game, everybody's Heisman lock. Everybody on the broadcast is even like, hey, he can play bad in this game and still win the Heisman. And that's how big of a front runner he was at this point. And he would go on to run away with it. As we mentioned the coaches, though, you had Bobby Bowden, as we talked about. And right now, too, Mike, we should take a second, too, because, Bobby Bowden, when we're recording this, just tested positive for COVID-19. I think there are reports today that he was back in the hospital. So our thoughts are with him and his family. And hopefully when you're hearing this, everything is okay with the Bowdens, because he is a treasure for college football. Yeah, you're breaking news to me. So I didn't realize that he had gotten COVID-19 and he was in the hospital. So best wishes to Bobby Bowden. Obviously, again, he was my mortal enemy back when I was 10, 15 years old watching Florida State and Miami, but never had anything but respect, as I mentioned before, for his Florida State teams. Yeah, no doubt. One name that I always was very familiar with on the sideline with him, Mickey Andrews, the defensive coordinator, was there for so long by his side. But you see him, he's still in his sixth season, but relatively speaking, he's a younger Mickey Andrews and newer to this Florida State team. But you could recognize him immediately, even though he's been out of the game for a little while. He's a guy that you automatically latched onto as soon as I saw him. Yeah, Mickey Andrews. He might have even lasted into the Jimbo regime, didn't he? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he was around. I think so. Yeah, he's one of these guys. He's like a Bud Foster of Virginia Tech. He's just been he was the defensive coordinator there for so long. And then, of course, you have two legendary head coaches. You have Bobby Bowden for Florida State, and who could tell a story with the best of them, can he? Mm-hmm. Man, his interviews are so fun to watch. And then you had, obviously, on the Notre Dame side, you had Lou Holtz, who me and you both worked with once upon a time. Yeah, and it's a different Lou Holtz now. We'll talk about that a little bit. But this Lou Holtz, man, I'll give the guy credit. I mean, you see why he was such a successful coach, right? Not only is he just a hyper-focused, great motivator, but he's very active this time. And this maybe is one of his best years. At least he's in the middle of those 4 or 5 really, really great years of his career where he's up and down the sideline pacing the entire game. He's getting in guys' faces. I mean, we're going to talk about some of this as we go through the game. But this was active Lou Holtz, and you could see why he was so successful. Yeah, if you want to see a human being in control of a situation, watch this game and watch Lou Holtz. You could just tell from his mannerisms on the sideline. He is plugged into everything going on the field. He has complete control over his team. He knows exactly what his team's capable of. He holds everyone accountable. He was like a master at this point. He really was. I get the same feeling watching him in this game as I do when I watch Saban. Like, they know they're plugged into everything that's going on. Nothing's getting by them. There's not a situation that they didn't cover throughout the week to get their team prepared for. And that's what you were dealing with Notre Dame at this time period. They're very contrasting styles too. Did you feel that way? Like when you see Holtz, as you mentioned, he's locked into every aspect of the game. He knows what's happening, what needs to be happening, and he's looking down the line. Bobby was always he's obviously a tremendous coach, one of the greatest to ever do it. But his style's a little different. He's much more laid back. He's not going to get in your face as much. He's going to let his coordinators do their thing. He's very, very much more in control and calm. Yeah, think of Holtz as more of a micromanager, and think of Bobby Bowden as hey, look, we worked hard in practice. We've done everything we need to do. Now go out and do it. I'm not going to get on you the day of the game. If we're worrying about getting you better the day of the game, we probably didn't do a good job during practice. And Lou Holtz is, I'm going to micromanage everything and try to make it so nothing gets screwed up. Fair enough. Well, let's get into the broadcast. So now usually when we get in the broadcast, we kind of jump right into the game. But this NBC broadcast was tremendous, number one. Awesome production, great quality, great information. But the pregame was really good. And we don't get a lot of pregames on this show when we're going back and watching these games. But this one we did. And it's Bob Costas obviously hosting kind of the pregame portion. And I thought what was great about this, a few things stood out to me, Mike, and I'm sure you probably saw these and you probably have your own observations as well. So I'll give you a couple of things that I saw in this pregame. Let's start with the Open. The Open was, let me let you explain it, because this you told me this was your favorite Open of all time, and maybe college sports. I don't know. I'll let you speak for yourself. Go ahead and explain it.
Okay. So first of all, the person narrating the intro was Bob Costas. So we're already starting with the greatest narrator of sports ever. Okay. So we'll start there. Second, the most inspirational sports movie of this time period by far was Rudy. Okay. The movie Rudy, about the Notre Dame football player, which if you don't know that,
yeah,
I find it weird you're listening to this podcast
exactly.
if you don't know who Rudy is. Okay. You have a iconic bed of music from that movie playing under Bob Costas' voice the entire time. Okay. So remember, this game's on November 13th, 1993. Rudy was released on October 13th, 1993. So as if you couldn't add to the Notre Dame lore enough, you have this going on as well as a subplot with Rudy, which was a hugely popular movie back in the day. And you just have Bob Costas going through the traditions of Notre Dame, what it stands for. And it's like, I know the term poetry in motion is overplayed, but this might be where that term was developed, because it was like a masterclass in how to get someone pumped up for a game. I think it might be the best intro to a game I've ever seen.
I thought it was really good. I don't think it was my favorite ever. I don't know what that would be, but I thought it was really good.
Exactly. That's my point. They normally stink. These intros normally stink, and you fast forward through them.
Hey, I liked one of the ones we did, the North Carolina game down in New Orleans in the Final Four, but you told me that you didn't like that one that much, but I regress. That was the previous episode. You go back and watch it. But it was a very good open to the broadcast. But then Bob Costas, I like the fact that, because all the marketing behind this game, much like they do now, you got to sell the crap out of it, right? And NBC's got a limited amount of broadcasts, right? They're the official broadcast partner for Notre Dame, so they get all the Notre Dame games. But they don't have games like you see now on ESPN where there's 10 games a day on a Saturday, where they have to spread out the resources. Everything's pumped into this game specifically. And with that comes all the, hey, we got to blow this thing out game of the century. And it was, 1 versus 2 championship front runners, Heisman front runner, all this stuff. But as Bob comes into the show, he takes the approach of, hey, let this game speak for itself. I don't need to call it the game of the century. He kind of downplayed it a little bit and just kind of talked about how important this was from his perspective, and didn't give me all the hoopla and trying to sell me the game. He didn't give you any of that. He was just straightforward to the point out of the gate. So I appreciated that for him. Now, I thought it was very interesting too. Did you notice when Florida State got off the bus, they were showing them? Florida State wore green hats with a gold Florida State logo on the front, and it had on the side, it had a shamrock on the side of the hat. Did you notice this?
I didn't notice it. No.
They came off the bus with these hats on. And I'm thinking, why are they wearing green? Number one, I mean, are they just playing into the whole theme? Or are they just trying to kind of get under the skin of Notre Dame, right? Trying to steal some of that luster. But those hats actually had shamrocks on the side of them. That's what they wore getting off the bus. The other part of this too, speaking of coming into the stadium, you were kind of caught off guard by Notre Dame's pregame ritual.
Yeah, if this is a Notre Dame pregame ritual, I know Notre Dame fans will crush me for not knowing this, because this is the kind of thing they get weirdly offended by. But the team literally went from attending mass and walked right over to the game. I mean, look, we just played the Rudy music. We got Touchdown Jesus in the background. It's fall in South Bend, and now we're walking over from church. I mean, this is like, this pregame show is hitting every single point on the Pentagon here. Like we're just hitting all of them.
And before we even get to the broadcast to the game broadcast, Bobby Bowden does a pregame interview, a great sit down with Bob Costas. And Bob Costas is a great interviewer to begin with, but he gets Bobby to open up about, some of his previous seasons where they had the missed kicks and they had the going for 2 and they didn't get it, and a lot of these things, and had him open up about how important this game was and how important a national championship was for his legacy.
Great interviewer and great interviewee is how I would describe this interview.
Yeah.
Just classic. And look, at this point, Florida State is known for missing these kicks against Miami, most notably. They're known for that, so much so that their kicker was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Okay. So this is a major theme. They're 73-9 since 1987 and no national championships. And remember, they got their arch rival, who off the top of my head, I believe won 4 national championships in the 80s. Okay. I think Miami won 4 in the 80s, 81, 83, 87, and 88. I'm pretty sure. So you have that in the background also.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So a couple of like jaw-dropping moments in this broadcast early on, watching it, because things I don't remember. First one hits me in the first few minutes of this broadcast. Bob Costas does his spiel at the beginning. He tosses over to John Dockery for the first report. And I love it. He's got his starter jacket on, right? There's so much 90s vintage elements to this broadcast, right, in this game. But he had the starter jacket. It was a blue and black multicolored starter's jacket. He does his report. Then Bob gets it back and tosses it over to none other than O.J. Simpson. And that was my first jaw-dropping moment. O.J. Simpson was on this broadcast. Holy cow.
Oof. And before I go into O.J. here, Miami won championships in 83, 87, 89, and 91. So they did win 4, just not the years I said. I don't want to get crushed again, so just to mention that. But back to O.J., okay? I think I was drinking water at the time. It was one of those you almost spit the water out of your mouth moments. I quickly scrambled to see what the date of this game was, just to refresh my memory.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened in November. The murders happened in June of 94, right? So this is roughly, 6-7 months before the murders. And I was like, wow. And one thing I'll say about OJ is he was a terrible sideline reporter. He was horrible. He must have had a really high Q rating for them to put him on these broadcasts and I'm not just saying it because he's a double murderer. Like, this is in the moment. He was really bad.
Yeah, I mean, he had some cringe moments for me, too. He did point out the kicker was a big element to this. As you kind of mentioned, there was a missed kick in this game early on. He pointed out the grass length, the shortest he could ever remember the grass being at Notre Dame Stadium. So that speaks to me that Notre Dame wants the best game to be played today. Did you catch that?
And OJ would know because he played there in the 60s. So he would know about the grass length because he played there 30 years prior.
He did have one report during the game, too, where he said, I think he's talking to Derek Brooks, and Derek Brooks told him about his injury. And he finished it with, yeah. And Derek said, yeah, I'm hoping to play, Juice. Like, he had to throw his own nickname. Like that's what the guys are saying, too, on the sideline, like they're buddy-buddy. But I digress. But that was the first jaw-dropping moment for me, was seeing OJ. The next thing that really kind of caught me off guard was the locker room setup at Notre Dame. And I don't think it's like this anymore. They've renovated the stadium since, right? I think they renovated it in 97-ish, mid to late 90s. So they brought it up the code, essentially, in a lot of aspects. But this was during the time when Notre Dame and the visitors came out of the same tunnel. And as they're coming into this game, Notre Dame's already in the tunnel waiting. Florida State's coming through there. You're talking, 65, 70 players Florida State, 90 players, some odd players for Notre Dame, kind of crowding this locker. And as you can imagine, as Florida State's waiting to come on the field, to take the field in front of this visiting crowd as the number 1 team in the country, there's a lot of back and forth and almost a little bit of a scuffle in the tunnel, but you never see this anymore. I don't know when this changed, but this is just one of those added elements to this game that just made it, took it to that next level.
Yeah, so to set the scene, a little more what Ben's talking about, you had Notre Dame come out kind of prematurely and stand in the hallway like, oh, this is our hallway, leading to our field. You don't walk through here. You know what I mean? Kind of staring Florida State down. Florida State is like, what is this? Terrible idea to have the locker room set up like this. Even more terrible if your own team is going to sit there and mean mug the team on the way out. You know what I mean? But like you mentioned, this is not an issue anymore. They engineer stadiums a little bit differently, but yeah, added a little bit sense of intensity to what was about to happen on the field for sure.
No doubt. Well, this broadcast, as we mentioned, the 2 sideline guys, Dockery and Simpson. In the booth, you had Charlie Jones and Todd Christensen, who was rocking the stash for this game.
Yep, Todd Christensen, a legendary Notre Dame tight end, most famously known for being on the Raiders, also in the NFL. And you had Charlie Jones on the play-by-play. If you watch the AFC in the 90s, 80s and 90s, he was one of the he not only did Notre Dame games, but he also did NFL games. So a voice you would recognize even if you don't recognize the name.
Yeah, so they had all hands on deck for this game. 2 sideline, Bob Costas hosting from a set down on the field. I mean, they had it all for this game, as you can imagine. So let's jump into it, Mike. And we'll have some outdated items too later, so make sure you stay tuned to the end for those because there's a lot to talk about again during this game. Out of the gates early, some thoughts from the first quarter. Florida State ran what they called a fast break offense. I don't really remember this. I don't know if this was named because of Charlie Ward as the quarterback and also the school's point guard. But basically when they brought in a couple extra receivers and ran 4 wide, this formation in this offense seems even a little bit outdated now, but it was so different then and so much more up-tempo and aggressive than what we were used to.
Absolutely. And this was like a trend-setting type of offense. You had like he was like a true point guard on the field, Charlie Ward. I mean, calling his own plays, calling his own audibles. Just to correct myself again, second time on this podcast, Todd Christensen played for BYU, not Notre Dame. So before I get crushed, he definitely played for the Raiders, though.
Mike, I can just edit the stuff out in post if you'd rather do that. But if you want to call yourself out on the show, that's fine as well. I'll let you do it.
I know. I have to be honest, So anyway, the Florida State offense, look, this offense worked because of Charlie Ward. There was not a lot of college quarterbacks back then that could run plays on the fly, have 4 receivers, process the information, and find the open man like he could. He was just a maestro.
You could tell he saw the field differently than everybody else. The game was so much slower to him, I think, than anybody else around him because he was never quick to act. He would always just kind of, it looked like at times he was kind of going in slow motion. When he would kind of move around in the pocket looking for guys or when he would scramble, it was just always kind of a nonchalant look, and then boom, he would kind of make a move or a cut or turn on the second gear, shift up the gears, and take off. But you could tell this game, he just processed things much more differently than anybody else around him.
Yeah, he's one of these vintage quarterbacks that you see a lot more now that kind of spread the ball around everywhere. And that's why you know all these names. That's why you know Warwick Dunn, William Floyd, Kes McCorvey, Tamarick Vanover. Remember, McCorvey and Tamarick Vanover weren't even the starting 2 wide receivers. They were like the 3rd and 4th wide receivers that came in. And they're arguably like the most identifiable names from this team. That's how much Charlie Ward spread the ball around.
Yeah, they were actually part of that fast break formation. They weren't even on the starting lineup when they showed it. They had to add them in when they showed the fast break offense. One receiver that I'd forgotten about, but Matt Fryer. This guy looked like a quarterback playing wide receiver. He wore the number 12. He kind of had that demeanor about him, like, just a quarterback. But this is a guy I did not remember, but he made a few plays in this game.
Yeah, he's like a Julian Edelman. Oh, I'm a tough guy. I'm going to find the seam in the defense. And then once I find the seam, I'm going to sit there and catch the ball and get my brains knocked in. You know what I mean? One of those guys.
But he was stockier and he was built more like a quarterback than like a Julian Edelman, like a small, fast, shifty guy.
Yeah, he was like exactly. He was like a early '90s version of Julian Edelman.
He was the slower, less evolved version.
Yeah, they haven't figured out like smaller guy can find creases better than a big, stocky quarterback-looking guy.
Yeah, well, Florida State went right down the field their opening drive. 89 yards, a balanced offense too. Ran the ball, passed the ball, got it all over the field. Multiple guys got involved. They made it look really easy out of the gates. It was one of those where, and a lot of times I try not to go back and look at the score beforehand, Mike. Just sometimes obviously know what happens. But this was one of those games that I didn't really remember how it played out. But you watch that opening drive and you think, Florida State is going to outmatch this team. And there's a good chance if they continue to click, they could run away with this game with the way it started.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but I have to. I have to get a dig in at Notre Dame some point here. Watching their defense against this offense reminded me of every other time for the last 15 years I've watched Notre Dame's team against a team with a good quarterback and good receivers. I mean, they just look so much more athletic. But to Notre Dame's credit, they came right back with an 80-yard touchdown drive of their own, capped off by a 32-yard touchdown to make it 7-7. So, and Notre Dame came roaring right back. Didn't waste any time.
Yeah, and you had it's a reverse call too. I mean, so I thought this game was interesting too because you had a very good mix of offense. You had some option. You had a 3-back formation from Notre Dame. They ran a couple of times. They called it a full house backfield, but you had some reverse passes. You had a halfback pass. I mean, this game had a lot of different types of offenses in it. It's a very balanced approach. And this Notre Dame, as you mentioned, the first touchdown, Adrian Jarrell, 32 yards on a reverse, caught Florida State completely off guard. But that was a big answer to me. And I was like, man, these guys actually do have some speed. Because I'm so used, as you mentioned, to watching Notre Dame now. And they look really good, Mike, at times when they're playing a lot of that non-conference schedule they match up with. And they play those academies pretty tough. And they look pretty good typically. But when they get matched up with some of these premier teams who have recruited top 10 classes year in, year out, and they look completely outmatched. And that's what I thought they looked like as you talked about that first drive, but you could see some speed in this roster. They still had it. They were maybe starting to fall behind the college football landscape a little bit, but they were still there now, and that touchdown was a big part of that. But did you realize Jarrell, who ran that in, was also the punter for this team?
Yeah, he came later in the game. I was like, is that the guy who just ran for the touchdown? That's like
they had a couple guys.
That's very Notre Dame, by the way.
A couple guys playing multiple ways. Oh yeah, I mean that's that hard nose, that grit that Notre Dame brings. Right, these guys will sacrifice and play multiple positions.
Team first.
No divas, Mike. No divas. Yeah. Right. This team had it all. So we saw also pregame, as I mentioned, a big deal made out of Scott Bentley. Scott Bentley, he had like the swagger of the early '90s, right? Like. He had like the shaved head, kind of a fade. He wore like a flat brim cap, and he had that look about him. He looked like a guy, honestly, that would play for Miami, if you want to be honest about it. But he missed his first kick from 54 yards, wide right, as you would imagine. But good leg, very good leg. And they said he kicked a few 60-yarders in high school.
No, Ben. They said he kicked 10 over. They said he kicked 10 field goals over 60 yards in high school.
Look.
I don't believe that.
Mike, how many guys – you probably don't follow kicking recruiting as much as I do as an Alabama fan because you're always hoping the next guy that comes in has a leg that's accurate. I can't tell you how many guys I've heard or seen clips of that are kicking routinely 55 to 60-yard field goals. They make it look like it's just so easy. You hear this all the time. Like if you hear a guy kicking 50-yard field goals, it's just another kicker, it seems like, when you hear him in high school. So I heard that. I was like, yeah – he's sure he's got a good leg, but kicking 10 60-yard field goals or whatever they said seems like a bit of a stretch. I don't know.
Yeah, you know that Will Ferrell gif where he says, "I don't believe you."
Like, yeah, that's what you're thinking about.
Right when Charlie Jones said, I'm like, I don't believe you.
The other big part of this first quarter, Derek Brooks get injured. The play looked awful. Well, not awful. It wasn't the worst injury I've seen, but he gets hit where the turf, I guess, going back to OJ's point, the turf was cut too low and wasn't in greatest shape because he slips, loses his balance as like the runner's coming into him. So he gets kind of plowed over as he's lost his balance, and his leg bends back up underneath him, his left leg, ankle and all. And look, I give the guy credit. Dude's tough as hell because he gets up, right, and runs and basically carries himself off the field. He's got eventually by the time he gets off the field, he's got 5 athletic staffers around him trying to help him off. This day and age, Mike, that's one of those where like coaches like, hey, just go ahead and lay down. Just go ahead and lay down. Let us treat you. Give our defense a break. Take your time. But this is like early 90s old school toughness. He got off the field quickly, straight to the sideline. The game just continued. But this turned out to be a pretty big factor in this game.
Yeah, it did. He would be on and off the field with that injury. To his credit, he did try to tough through it and play. But remember, we're talking an all-time linebacker in the history of football in Derek Brooks. So significant injury for sure. Notre Dame rushed for 100 yards in this quarter. Okay, 12 rushes for 99 yards. You're beginning to see the sort of planting the seeds of how dominant this rushing attack would be throughout the game. And we're at 7-7 here heading into the second quarter.
Yeah, and you nailed it. I mean, this rushing offense surprised me throughout the game, how they were able to open up huge holes all game against this defensive front for Florida State. I was very surprised by that. And Notre Dame answered that opening score by Florida State with a quick touchdown to start that second half, which is only the second time, by the way, that Florida State had trailed all year. They had trailed briefly in an earlier game. I don't remember the opponent. You might. North Carolina got down 7-0 and won the game 33-7. So they had not faced much adversity throughout this season. But after that second touchdown, Mike, I got the sense they got rattled a little bit because when they came out from that touchdown, the first play they ran, and they're backed up in their, inside the 15 maybe, their own 15.
Yep.
They ran this halfback pass back to, let me go ahead and just try to break it down. I don't know the official term. Throw it out to the right, or a lateral to the right side to a receiver. He throws it back across the field laterally. Not even Charlie Ward breaking downfield. Laterally. The width of the field to where a Notre Dame defender is in the backfield. He almost makes a play on the ball, but to my eyes, he got just tackled in the back by a Florida State offensive lineman. The crowd went crazy. And Charlie Ward catches it over there, and it's like, or drops it. I don't even remember what the result of the play. I just remember thinking, what are they even doing right now? at this moment.
It drives me nuts when teams that are very talented try to do this gadget stuff. Like after they just went down the field early in the first quarter, like we mentioned, sliced and diced Notre Dame with a normal offense. The only play that didn't work on that drive was a halfback pass they tried.
It was wide open.
They shredded Notre Dame everywhere else, and they come out and do this crap that they did here that you just described. And later in that drive, it leads to Charlie Ward, an interception by Charlie Ward, his first interception in 159 attempts. Notre Dame comes right back down, scores again. Jeff Burris, who played safety and running back in this game, runs for a touchdown. No mention of it by the announcers. Like it's not even that odd because he plays for Notre Dame, and why wouldn't this be the case? And 21-7 Notre Dame, and it happened in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it did. And I was shocked by how quickly they responded and really started building this lead. And they were a drop pass from maybe scoring again. I mean, they had a drive where they had a receiver wide open who drops the ball on Florida State's half of the field. Would have kept the drive alive. And
huge drop.
Yeah, it failed them. And not only that one, but they had so many dropped interceptions. And back to your point on Burris, this guy had his hands on so many Charlie Ward passes that were so catchable that he just completely missed on.
Yeah, this was not a good quarter for Florida State. Okay. With that, Notre Dame only allowed 62 yards on 6 drives after that dominant first drive that I talked about from Florida State. So all of the momentum is Notre Dame's to this point. With that said, Florida State had another turnover late in the second quarter that Notre Dame didn't cash in on. So at halftime, it's 21-7 Notre Dame. And like we mentioned, Florida State's 2 turnovers lead to 2 Notre Dame touchdowns. You can't stress enough. Notre Dame's got everything going right now. They got the running game going. Their defense is stymieing that high-powered Florida State attack, and we enter halftime.
Yeah, they could have been up more than what they were at that point. And going into halftime, back to the tunnels, by the way, those 2 teams went into the same tunnel again, same time. I just don't know how that happened and how it actually got along. I can't imagine being down like that, how frustrated Florida State would have been running into the locker room alongside Lou Holtz and that squad. Pretty amazing indeed. And we should mention too, Mike, did we even mention the quarterback for Notre Dame in this game? His name?
No, he was that nondescript. I did not have any recollection. His name's Kevin McDougal.
Exactly.
He wasn't terrible. But
I mean, we're at halftime. We hadn't even mentioned him yet.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. I was like, was this Rick Meyer? Was Rick Meyer there then? Or
no?
Who was it? And I was like, Kevin McDougal, what the hell?
And at this point in the season, too, he had 5 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. We're in November. We're in the second week of November right now. He had 5 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. So it kind of tells you all you really need to know about it. But we do need to give him at least a shout out because he was the quarterback of who would become the number 1 team in the country shortly after this game was over. But to go into the third quarter, FSU, you expect them to come out hot, 3 and out right out of the gates. Notre Dame gets down the field, but only gets a field goal, settles for a field goal, 24-7. And then we start seeing Work Done get more involved. He was kind of, as you mentioned, he didn't start, but he did play a decent amount in this game, a very young Work Done, but you could see the talent there, aware of how talented this guy was. It also made me think too, Mike, one of the reasons Florida State maybe isn't as good now here in 2020 is they were during this time period and then, well into the 2000s, the first decade there. Only over the last 4 or 5 years they've had a couple of good teams, but for the last decade, I'd say they haven't been the team they were for those 2 decades or so. There were so many guys, there are a couple guys on this team, and they've had so many through the years come from the Panhandle and specifically like Louisiana. Like Work Done was from New Orleans, I think. They had another guy from Baton Rouge. They've recruited a bunch of those guys around that area, but I think over the last decade or so, I think with Nick Saban, with LSU becoming what they are, they're not getting as many of those guys as they used to. I thought about that during this game.
Yeah, I was just going to say, was that a down period? From what I remember, Alabama was good during this time period.
They were the defending national championship this season. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think LSU was.
No, but Alabama never
LSU
at that time. They with some, but I mean, most of their recruits came from Alabama or the bordering states. Like some from Florida, Mississippi was pretty heavy, maybe a couple from Tennessee, but they recruited much heavier in Alabama at the time. They didn't go out as much, so they didn't. I don't remember them dipping into Louisiana a whole lot, although it's a very talented state. So,
and Ben, you had to mention the Jay Barker era with me here. You knew you had to mention it.
Oh yeah, I mean this is peak Jay Barker.
Jay Barker. One of the first times me and Ben met, I think how I impressed him was I started talking about Jay Barker. I think that was it.
Yeah, we did a pregame show with Jay Barker for a little bit down in Tuscaloosa, so it was fun working with him. But yeah, this is the Jay Barker era. He had some highlights during this time frame, and they were still. I think they may have had one loss at this point, but he had a long winning streak at that point. But yeah, anyway, back to the game. I just thought that on the recruiting note, why maybe Florida State is maybe not as good as and dominant as they were during this time. But third quarter, Dunn gets much more involved. Catches his first touchdown as a ball he caught out of the backfield, made it 24-14. And Mike, my first thing when he made that catch, what kind of setup did Notre Dame have with the fans, like essentially standing on the sideline? Like when he made that catch, Florida State fans, not like part of the traveling party or guys with sideline passes. I mean, maybe they could have been. I don't think so. These were dudes with starter jackets and like Russell Athletic sweatshirts that are running out there like slapping him on the helmet in the third quarter of this game between number 1 and number 2.
Yeah, that was weird, and I love how you mentioned the starter jackets a lot because it's awesome, but that's those maroon, that burgundy and gold kind of yellowish starter jackets, so you can kind of envision what they were, and everyone had like some variation of one of those starter jackets on.
They were all over. It's amazing. So there wasn't a whole lot of action this quarter. It's 24-14. The big thing at the end of this quarter, though, in this game, I don't remember many broadcasters have made so much out of the wind as these guys did this broadcast. And it wasn't like this was played in the middle of a hurricane, right? Or like a snowstorm. I mean, the wind, yeah, sure, it was, I guess, significant, but it wasn't like you're watching this game where like balls were soaring and flying and, hats were blowing off from the sideline and stuff. It didn't seem that out of control, but it was all they talked about.
I mean, add this to the list. If you're a football guy, you have to go back and watch this game because they're making a big deal about wind affecting the punting game and kicking game, players from Notre Dame playing offense and defense, the whole pregame show that we mentioned. I mean, this is just like, it's checking every single box here. They made such a big deal about the wind. And it was just funny because the punter at the end of the quarter for Notre Dame doesn't get the punt off before the quarter ends. And now Notre Dame has to punt into the wind and talk about like a fatal flaw. Like the announcers were disgusted at the punter. Lou Holtz, it was like blasphemous to him what just happened. It was like a big moment in the game, it felt like.
It did. They couldn't believe it, the change in momentum, and now they're punting into the wind. And to their credit, though, fourth quarter starts, the guy only kicks it about a net punt of about 30 yards. So, I mean, they did end up with good field position. It might have made sense to get that ball off, but regardless.
Remember, the guy who punted the ball was the guy who ran in the first touchdown for Notre Dame.
Right. Amazing. Speaking of that, you had Jeff Burris again, dropped another interception in this quarter early on. This guy, I mean, he made up for it, and he would make up for it in this game, in this quarter, towards the end. But I could not believe how many times he dropped the ball. Florida State did come down and score a field goal, make it a one-possession game, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, we do have a game here. But I could not believe that Notre Dame came right back down the field after giving up that lead of 24-7. Pressure's on. They come right back down. They go to that full house backfield formation with 3 running backs lined up parallel to each other. And Burris got the handoff again. His second rushing touchdown on 2 carries in this game. The guy that dropped about 4 interceptions in this game has 2 touchdown runs.
Yep, 2 carries, 17 yards, 2 touchdowns. And they ran it down Florida State's throats. Derek Brooks is back in the game at this point, but still dealing with the injury and is definitely not himself at this point. It's 31-17 Notre Dame with 6:53 left.
And Florida State doesn't put a drive together either. So they're at their own 37 with 6:15-ish left. They don't go for it. Down 2 touchdowns, they punt the ball. Now, they did have the wind at their back, I guess, as the announcers would say, but they still punted the ball. I was shocked. Christensen was all over. Why would they do this? Why would they make this decision? But to me, I kind of feel like you kind of have to go for it there, Mike, with 6 minutes left. That's a pretty conservative call.
Yeah, I was surprised, especially with the type of offense that we've been talking about this whole episode so far that Florida State had. Experienced quarterback. I think you put it in his hands there. I agree with Christensen. He made a big deal about it during the broadcast, but I think he was right.
They would get it back. And I thought one moment by Lou Holtz, and you probably saw this as well, there was a late hit along the sideline. Okay, again, 2-score game, right? You're just trying to don't do anything stupid, right? Don't make any mistakes. Don't just give them yardage. Make them earn it. Get back in this game down 2 scores. There was a play on the sideline. It was a bang-bang play. It wasn't anything absurd. But The linebacker came over and hit this guy late, out of bounds, 15-yard penalty. Lou Holtz sprints down the sideline. He's getting to the face of the players on the bench. I don't think he knew who the call was on. He's trying to identify that. Who was it? He's asking around. And I think like somebody like snitched on their teammate. He's like, it was so-and-so out there, coach, and like pointed out on the field. And he walked out on the field and like signaled at his player and waved him over to the sideline. We're mid-game, right? I think the clock stops and they're setting the ball. They're, getting the play set up. He's out there for like 6-7 yards from the field in his player's face. And I guess it's a teachable moment, maybe. And the guy looks like he's locked into coach and listening, but you never see this happen.
This is like full-fledged Lou Holtz on the field with the index finger in the air, directing his player to come towards him. We've all gotten that from our parents before. And he proceeds to scream at the guy like Woody Hayes style.
Yeah, spot on. To me, it was just amazing to watch that. It's so old school. You don't ever see that from coaches today. They would just be chastised for doing that, but no, Florida State keeps the drive alive, and they face a 4th and 20, and they throw a Charlie Ward, who, by the way, has his arm, man. I should have mentioned this earlier. This guy's throwing arm was incredible. I mean, there's very few guys that you see with the zip and velocity on the football that this guy had. And I think a couple of times it's probably why his teammates dropped a couple of passes, but also maybe why defensive backs dropped a couple. But this guy could hum it.
Yeah, he reminds me in that respect of like a Russell Wilson, where you're not really expecting it because he has such a small frame, but the ball jumps out of his hands.
Absolutely. And it did on this 4th down and 20 play, but it was tipped in the back of the end zone, drops up perfectly into McCorvey's hands, makes it 31-24. Another one of these, Mike, as we mentioned on our last episode, if you're a coach, you tell your player, just knock the ball down. He didn't, although it was very tough. It was kind of up in the air, his outstretched arms, but instead of just kind of batting it away, it goes off his hands and into the receiver and makes it a 1-score game.
Yeah, I mean, between the punter not paying attention to where the wind was, the personal foul with Lou Holtz losing his mind, and now not knocking the ball down, I mean, not a good moment for traditional Notre Dame fans here as the score is 31-24.
Yeah, we're just a couple of minutes left in this game, and Florida State doesn't get the onside, but they stop Notre Dame, get the ball back, and they're all-out block on this punt. And the punter, again, for Notre Dame, kicks it 5 yards. It's a 5-yard punt. They were like, did that get tipped? What happened there? Is that just a shank? Literally 5-yard punt.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. And Florida State got the ball back with a minute left. They end up with 2 shots at the end zone, but they come up short.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that. I mean, they got down the field pretty quickly in that little of time. And credit, like, the receivers got out of bounds when they needed to. The players were making heads-up plays getting down there. And as you said, they had 2 plays, but it was kind of close because maybe Charlie Ward made a mistake here. They kind of pointed out on the broadcast, but they get down inside. They get down to the 14. Clock stops for the first down, as they do in college. Spot the ball. Instead of just going up to the line and just spiking it right away and getting, you're going to have 2 plays after that at least, he just takes the snap, rolls around, incomplete pass, and there's only 3 seconds left. You're down to 1 play. I mean, I think if you stop the clock with 9 seconds, you have a chance of getting 3 plays off there. At least maybe a quick
That's
5-yard
tough,
out,
though.
something.
Weren't they on like the 20?
They're at the 14.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like maybe a quick, yeah.
Yeah. Or in 14 seconds, you can get a guy across the middle, throw to the end zone in like 3 seconds. You know what I mean? So I don't know. They pointed it out, but anyway, 3 seconds left. The ball gets batted down in the end zone. Notre Dame hangs on, wins this one 31-24. I thought, Mike, for this game, I thought Florida State, how many gadget plays they ran was kind of shocking to me. I mean, partly because of the era of football we're in, but also you still don't even see that now. I mean, you might one or two reverse or halfback pass, but it seemed like they ran like 4 or 5 of these type plays.
Yeah, and like there wasn't that big of a talent disparity between Notre Dame and Florida State, but Florida State definitely had an advantage when it came to their depth at receiver, as compared to the Notre Dame secondary. You saw that with how good of a game Kes McCorvey and Tam McVanover had. I thought they should have took more advantage of that rather than those gadget plays. When the game's over here, though, Ben, I know you must have heard this. 31-24, Notre Dame wins. We're storming the field. And Charlie Jones, first thing he says is, and I quote, "The ghost of Newt Rockne is living, and he is smiling." This just puts like the icing, the bow on the present, the icing on the cake of all the Notre Dame traditions we've been hearing about during this whole game. It was perfect.
Yeah, it really was. It was a heck of a game, great finish. And, from that point, Mike, Notre Dame would actually go on to lose the very next week. They lost to Boston College at home.
It's another great game.
Another tremendous game, too. You're right. And they were down 22 points in that game, came back, but Boston College won it on a field goal. So Notre Dame basically knocked out of the running.
Tom Coughlin led Boston College squad, I believe.
Yeah, you're right. And then on the other side, Florida State only dropped this number 2 after this game was over. So they didn't lose much ground because of how well they played on the road at Notre Dame. Fighting off the ghost of Newt Rogney, they were still able to come within one score, one play of tying that game. And they were number 2. They would go on the next week to rout NC State 62-3. They would face off against Florida, a top 10 Florida in Gainesville, win that game, and that would set them up in the national championship against Nebraska. Mike, Nebraska, Tommy Frazier, a young Tommy Frazier. They would win that game 18-16 to win a national championship. And they still, after all this, they still got Bobby Bowden his first national championship.
Yep, and I'll remember that Florida State national championship because they beat Nebraska 18-16, like you mentioned, in the Orange Bowl. So they won their first national championship in the stadium where Miami played their home game. So double ouch there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll mention, too, this was during the Bowl Coalition period of college football. During this game, they showed the Bowl Coalition standings or rankings. This one was only around for 3 years, Mike. 92, 93, 94. And they basically did it because 90, 91 had co-champs. So they wanted to have a clear 1 versus 2 game. And there's obviously a lot of flaws with this. They got Alabama and Miami the year before 1 versus 2. They got 1 versus 2 here, but the big controversy on this was West Virginia this year went undefeated in the regular season, but they were, I think, 3 in one poll, 2 in the other, coaches and AP. But the Bowl Coalition bumped up Nebraska there in their place, and Florida State obviously was there as well, even with 1 loss, and they got in. And there was this big controversy that West Virginia didn't as an undefeated team. West Virginia ended up and lost by 30 to Florida in the championship game, so it actually justified the decision. But this is just one reason why the Coalition actually was phased out a couple of years later. Didn't stick around very long. The other part of that was the Big Ten and the Pac-12, or Pac-10 at the time, both had their ties to the Rose Bowl, so they couldn't get out of that game when they were the champion. So they could not play in that Bowl Coalition matchup wherever they were. So just an interesting time in college football all around.
Yeah, if you think the college football system is screwed up now,
it took us a while to get there.
Yeah, the days of the bowl tie-ins and how much that screwed things up, it was maddening year after year, sort of with just different scenarios that would play out.
Charlie Ward, as we mentioned, would go on to win the Heisman. Mike, do you remember who finished second that year to him?
So Gino Torretta was the year before.
Yep.
Right? Okay. 93. So we're before Rashaan Salam, right? I can't even guess.
Tennessee quarterback. Heath
the kid.
Schuler.
Heath Schuler. Yeah.
Finished third on that list? David Palmer from Alabama. Marshall Faulk was fourth. So Charlie Ward, though, he ran away with it. He had 7.
Who was third?
David Palmer.
David Palmer from Alabama?
Yeah, the Deuce.
Really?
Yeah. I did it all, Mike. Hey, show a little bit of respect, buddy. I don't like the sound of your voice.
I didn't know
your voice right now.
The Heisman. Yeah, no, I didn't. I'm surprised.
Yeah, he had a really good year, but Charlie Ward got 740 first place votes, and the difference between first and second in the total voting was 2310 to 688. So far and away the best team or best player in college football that year, and they went to win the championship. Let's go outdated, Mike, before we get out of here. A few things for me. Obviously, Nebraska being ranked third. We saw the bottom line scroll through a couple of times with score updates, which I always love seeing who's doing what in this time period. They had Tommy Frazier stats up there, and I just was thinking, man, what's to come with this guy over the next few years?
Yeah, this is the day and age of the scroll, like you said, and they would show the top 25 games. They wouldn't show every game like they do now. And if you happen to have a relative or a neighbor that may have put a couple dollars on a game, like, I don't know if you could imagine this, but this is literally how they're finding out how their bet is going. Every 10 minutes when the scroll goes by, and like the tension when like your uncle bet on the 20th ranked team and the ticker was going, 15th ranked team, 16th ranked team. Then it would come to the 20th ranked team. Pretty intense.
And by the way, we didn't mention it, but Bob Costas did reference in the pregame show that Notre Dame was a touchdown favorite in this game.
They were.
Right on the money.
No, Florida State was, I think.
No, Notre Dame, because they said Florida State on a neutral field or in Tallahassee would be a favorite. But here in the hallowed grounds, I don't need to say that, but inside Notre Dame Stadium, they are about a touchdown underdog. So, yeah, that's how much Vegas appreciated, Mike, and respected that home field advantage. Speaking of that home field advantage, did you realize, I didn't, they had no lights at the stadium this time, right? This is still like a lot of these northern teams didn't have lights in their stadium. But Michigan got lights, like 5 years ago? I don't know, something like that. But they didn't have any lights. They actually showed a shot of the temporary lighting truck in the parking lot that was providing lights for the field because this game was starting to get dark in the fourth quarter.
You know what was interesting? The reason I know that lighting company, Musco Lighting,
why?
Is for a long time, the Little League World Series did not have lights either. And they were the company that put the lights at the Little League World Series.
Oh, wow. They're like the temporary lighting specialists. Still, I think,
they
too.
are.
They still do it. I looked them up. I was like, is this company still around? Because now that like every facility has lights, are they still in business? But apparently they still do it. The other thing we had at halftime, too, they were promoting Marino and Cunningham coming up on the halftime show. Those two great NFL quarterbacks. This is a great era for NFL football.
Yeah, the bummer they were discussing was both of them were coming off injuries. So
yeah,
but I think that worked out fine for both of them. Both very good pro quarterbacks, and you had that NBC pregame show with Will McDonough. He was like the first like insider, like Adam Schefter. He's Sean McDonough, who everyone probably knows, the announcer. His father, Will McDonough, longtime reporter for the Boston Globe, and he would come out with these nuggets about the players and organizations, and he'd be like, no way, Bill Parcells is going to leave the Patriots? No way. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it was. I remember that. Yeah.
The other outdated I had, and the last one I had was this was also the time in college football where you had the headset cable guy. You know, now we got all these wireless communications, but this was the time when like there was one guy that was there to keep the coach's headset cable organized and wrapped up. And I felt bad for the guy following Lou Holtz because Lou Holtz was up and down the sideline the whole time. You know, this guy, not a very enviable job.
Once there was no more need for that guy as technology changed, he became the get back guy.
Yeah, probably so.
He became the get back coach.
He still got a job. That's good to see. What do you have? You got anything else outdated?
Just like every Florida State linebacker had a neck roll.
Yeah, you love that.
And my thing is, I can't get over how big the pads were. Like, I would just love to see the meeting where they decided, hey, does everyone have huge pads on? It makes them slower. Like, who was the first person to realize that? Hey, one other outdated thing I forgot to mention real quick. This is the year, 1993, Auburn was on probation but undefeated.
Yeah.
Coached by Bobby Bowden's son, Terry Bowden.
Good point.
I noticed that, and noticed that when they showed the rankings.
Definitely should have mentioned that in terms of controversy at the end. But, yeah, I think they would go on to maybe claim a national championship. I don't know. But either way, they were on probation. But, yeah, so great information, Mike. Good. This game was – where do you put this? We've done some really good games so far. What are we, 46 episodes in? Where do you put this game on the list just in terms of enjoyment going back and watching it?
Oh, in terms of enjoyment going back and watching it, it's top 3 for me for sure. We've done a lot of these now. And these regular season college football games we've done have been awesome, haven't they?
Yeah, they're remarkable.
If you haven't been following us, go back and we did the Doug Flutie Hail Mary game. We did the Alabama LSU 2011 game, another game of the century. Last week we did the prayer of Jordan Hare.
Yeah, we've done some great ones.
Yeah, another great one. So these games deliver, but this one with everything else surrounding it that we discussed at the top of the show, it was right up there for me.
And I'll echo what Mike said. If you are a college football fan, go back and watch this game because this was the time when college football became, a national phenomenon, right? I mean, it was late 80s, early 90s. I mean, college football is big, but now TV is starting to have more of a presence. These teams are becoming more well-known outside of their regions, and you're starting to see the fans increase and the atmospheres get bigger and the environment be unique. So you can kind of get all that, a feel for that in this game. It kind of encapsulates all that over these 60 minutes. It's a great game, great broadcast. NBC did a great job, and I enjoyed watching it as well. We'll have the game up on our website, distantreplaypodcast.com. You can watch it in its entirety there. And also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We'd love to hear from you and watch whatever game you have on your list. We'll put it on our list and get to it at some point. Also, we have some mini-sodes coming up as well, some shorter episodes. Make sure to check those out. We want to kind of hit on some quick events or this day in sports history or some true crime stuff. Just some quicker episodes, but some historical look at sports still. That's the theme of the podcast and what we try to do. So keep an eye out for those. Hit subscribe, please, and leave us a review. We'd appreciate that as well. Mike, thanks again, man. Enjoyed it. Had a lot of fun with this game.
Absolutely. And until next time.